Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you've joined me today. Wherever you are in the world, whether it's early morning with the sun just creeping over the horizon or deep in the quiet of night, I want you to take a moment and notice where you're sitting, the sounds around you, maybe even the faint rhythm of your own heartbeat. I'd love it if you shared in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to think that right now, in this very moment, people across countless time zones are gathering together to trace a story that once held the world in its trembling hands. Today, we're stepping into a world of shadows and whispers, a world where ordinary streets hide extraordinary secrets, and where the life of a single man, quiet, unassuming, brilliant, shaped events that could have brought nations to the brink of annihilation. This is the story of Oleg Penkovsky, the double agent whose intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 changed the course of history. Imagine the weight of knowledge carried in silence. Imagine holding in your mind the locations of nuclear missiles, the movements of armies, the hidden calculations of governments, all while navigating a society built on suspicion, secrecy, and the constant threat of discovery. That was Penkovsky's life, and yet, for all its peril, he moved with a subtle courage that few could imagine. Now, I want to ask you, before we dive fully into his story, how would you measure the line between betrayal and patriotism? If the life of a nation depended on the risk you were willing to take, where would you draw that line? And do you think it's possible for one individual to hold the fate of millions in their hands without succumbing to fear or doubt? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As we begin, picture the city of Moscow in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The streets are hushed under the weight of winter frost, gray buildings stretching into the misty sky. Offices hum with quiet efficiency, corridors echo with soft footsteps, and every glance may carry suspicion. In this environment, every gesture, every choice, every secret note passed from hand to hand could mean survival or death. Penkovsky lived in that world, carefully balancing loyalty, conscience, and the invisible threads of intelligence that connected him to the West. And yet, the story we're about to uncover isn't just about espionage or military strategy. It's about human courage under unimaginable pressure, the weight of moral choice in the quietest moments, and the subtle, extraordinary ways one person can influence the course of history. As we move forward, listen to the rhythm of the streets, the echo of footsteps in empty corridors, and the whispers that hide behind closed doors. They are the sounds that shaped a crisis threatening to engulf the entire world. Throughout this documentary, you'll find yourself questioning what it means to serve one's country, to betray, to protect, and to survive. Was Penkovsky a traitor to his homeland, or a patriot in the truest sense, working to prevent catastrophe? And what drives someone to risk everything, family, reputation, life itself, for the sake of something larger than themselves? Keep those questions in mind as we trace his journey. And if any answers or new questions come to mind, share them below. Now, lean back. Let your mind drift into the streets of Moscow and the shadowed offices where Oleg Penkovsky moved with extraordinary precision and caution. Allow the story to settle around you like a soft, suspenseful fog, carrying you into a world of secret messages, whispered meetings, and intelligence that could tip the balance between war and peace. And with that, let's begin our journey together, starting at the very beginning, in the shadowed alleys and quiet offices where Penkovsky's double life first took shape. Welcome to Chapter 1, Shadowed Beginnings, the Making of a Double Agent. The wind cut through the narrow alleys of Moscow like a cold, invisible blade, carrying whispers of fear, suspicion, and secrets better left unspoken. On the frost-crusted windows of a modest apartment, a thin veil of condensation blurred the outline of a young boy standing silently, watching the dim glow of street lamps flicker through the snow. That boy, Oleg Penkovsky, had already learned that silence could be louder than words, that watching without being seen was a skill more precious than gold. In the shadowed corners of Stalin's Soviet Union, lessons like these were not taught in schools. They were carved into the soul by necessity, by the murmur of threats, by the ever-present awareness that every glance, every gesture might betray you. Oleg's earliest memories were of a world suspended between war and ideology. Born in 1919, he came into existence at the end of a revolution, into a society attempting to stitch itself together with fervent ideology and iron discipline. His father, a devoted military officer, spoke little but commanded everything. Oleg watched him move through the home with quiet authority, a measured step, a clipped word, a hand that could comfort or correct with equal force. From these small impressions, the boy began to understand patterns of behavior, of loyalty, of fear. He would carry them into adulthood, unknowingly preparing for a life that demanded extraordinary attention to detail, extraordinary control over oneself, extraordinary courage under pressure. Moscow in the 1920s and 1930s was a city of contrasts. Underneath the grand Soviet architecture, under the propaganda banners proclaiming unity and progress, there were alleys that smelled of coal smoke and fear, where neighbors whispered of arrests, of disappearances, of people vanishing in the night, leaving nothing behind but rumors and terror. Children learned early to listen more than they spoke, to question only silently, to obey without a sign of hesitation. Penkovsky was no exception. He learned to read expressions, to notice the micro changes in tone, the fleeting twitch of an eyebrow, the subtle tightening of a jaw. Every adult around him was a mystery, a potential enemy, a cipher. The lesson was simple. Trust was a luxury. Observation was survival. School offered another kind of training. In classrooms with peeling paint and stiff, unyielding desks, Oleg absorbed not only mathematics, literature, and history, but also the unspoken lessons of endurance and vigilance. Teachers could be kind one moment and severe the next, their moods as unpredictable as the political purges that swept the nation. He learned the careful art of discretion, the weight of silence, the invisible currency of knowledge. At 16, he could sit in a room full of adults and understand the undercurrents, sense the lies, detect the truths no one dared speak aloud. This was not talent, it was necessity. And necessity in the Soviet Union demanded mastery. War arrived like a shadow that consumed everything. As Europe descended into chaos in the 1940s, young Oleg found himself drawn into the vortex of military service. He saw firsthand the precision and brutality required by conflict, the cold calculations of strategy, the fragility of human life weighed against national objectives. He was intelligent, disciplined, and observant, qualities that did not go unnoticed. His superiors spoke in hushed tones of his potential, his acuity for intelligence work, his ability to remain composed when those around him panicked. It was during these years that Penkovsky began to internalize the duality that would define him for the rest of his life. The duality of duty and doubt, of loyalty and skepticism, of outward obedience and inward questioning. After the war, the Soviet Union streets remained silent, but the silence was not peace. It was the echo of surveillance, of paranoia, of a society that had learned to measure every word, every step, every breath. Penkovsky, now a man of experience and intellect, found himself navigating the intricate corridors of the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. The work was exacting, unrelenting, and permeated by secrecy. Every document he handled, every message he delivered, carried with it the weight of national security and the quiet tension of knowing that a single misstep could cost him everything, even life itself. The paper rustled under his fingers in the dim glow of his office lamp, and he could feel the tension in the air as if it were a living thing, ready to pounce at the slightest hesitation. Yet within this world of shadows, Penkovsky's mind was restless. He observed not only the movements of men and the mechanics of intelligence, but also the inconsistencies, the hypocrisies, the ideological rigidity that choked human potential. He began to see cracks in the armor of the system he served so diligently. The lessons from childhood, the careful watch, the patient silence, the ability to read subtle shifts, had matured into a tool he would wield not against external enemies, but in a far more perilous arena, the moral battlefield of the human conscience. In these corridors, Oleg met men and women whose lives were equally suspended between duty and fear. There were whispers behind closed doors, furtive glances across crowded offices, hurried notes slipped beneath heavy doors. Each encounter was a study in subtlety, in timing, in the silent negotiation of trust and betrayal. Penkovsky became a master of reading these invisible currents, a skill that would later allow him to dance along the razor's edge of espionage, navigating between two worlds whose truths could never fully converge. He married, built a home, raised a family, yet even within the domestic sphere, the tension of his professional life seeped through. Every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call, every shadow that lingered too long across the hallway could be a harbinger of danger. The duality of existence became more pronounced. The loving father, the attentive husband, and simultaneously the agent, the observer, the man whose mind was always measuring risk, always calculating outcomes. Sleep came in fragments, dreams haunted by corridors, whispers, and footsteps that might have been imagined, or might have been the vanguard of danger approaching his doorstep. And yet, it was not fear alone that shaped Penkovsky. There was curiosity, an insatiable desire to understand the world beyond the iron curtains, to gauge the intentions of those who could shape history in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Books, clandestine radio broadcasts, fragments of Western newspapers, these became windows into a world of ideas, strategy, and possibility that contrasted sharply with the rigid ideology surrounding him. In these quiet, secretive moments, he began to weigh the value of truth against the demands of loyalty, to ponder what actions might serve a greater good, even if they defied the mandates of his immediate superiors. The GRU provided access, but also constraints. Penkovsky maneuvered through protocols, clearances, and classified documents, always conscious of the ever-present eyes, always attuned to the silent signals of suspicion. Every memo he reviewed, every plan he helped draft, was accompanied by the unspoken knowledge that he was both a participant and a potential observer of his own downfall. The tension was a constant hum beneath his conscious thought, shaping decisions, modulating reactions, influencing interactions in ways imperceptible to most but glaringly obvious to him. Friends, colleagues, subordinates, they were part of the same latticework of observation and caution. Penkovsky learned not only to navigate these networks, but to read them, to understand who could be trusted in an environment where trust was a liability and betrayal a currency. He became adept at masking curiosity, disguising dissent as conformity, smiling at the right moments, silencing questions before they formed fully, and listening, always listening, to everything not said. The subtle click of a door, the rustle of a paper, the stifled laugh in a corner office. All were signals, pieces of a puzzle whose edges were invisible but whose patterns he could discern. In the quiet hours, as the city's frozen streets slept under a veil of frost and shadow, Penkovsky reflected on the journey that had led him here. Childhood lessons, wartime experience, professional discipline, intellectual curiosity, all converged to form a man uniquely capable of inhabiting dual realities, one loyal, one questioning, one obedient, one calculating, one visible, one hidden. And yet, the full measure of this duality remained untested, an uncharted territory awaiting the impetus that would define the course of history. It came in fragments. First, a rumor, a fleeting invitation, an unspoken question in a crowded room. Penkovsky, ever vigilant, noted each with meticulous care, aware that the smallest decision could ripple outward, affecting not only his life, but the lives of countless others, and perhaps even the fate of nations. He was at a precipice, one foot in the world he knew, the other dangling over the abyss of unknown consequences. Every instinct screamed caution, yet a deeper part of him, guided by curiosity and conscience, yearned to explore the possibility that loyalty and morality were not always aligned. The city exhaled frost and shadow. A lone figure crossed the street, boots crunching on ice, coat collar turned high against the wind, a briefcase clutched tightly as if containing secrets too volatile to entrust to the air. That figure, moving in silence yet weighed by the gravity of decisions unseen, was Penkovsky. In that movement, in that breath, in that moment, the foundations of a story that would soon grip the world were quietly laid. The boy who had watched the streets of Moscow, the young man who had survived the crucible of war, the officer who had learned to read every gesture and every pause, all converged, ready for the path that would demand courage beyond fear, calculation beyond instinct, and secrecy beyond imagination. And as the door of his apartment clicked shut behind him, as the whispers of the city pressed against glass and stone, Penkovsky felt the first true weight of destiny settle upon his shoulders. Somewhere in the shadows, choices were being made, unseen hands moving pieces in a game whose rules were written in silence, secrecy, and the murmur of fear. He did not yet know what path he would take, nor the consequences it would bring, but the world had begun to pivot around him. And in that quiet, snow-laden night, the first seeds of the story that would define the Cold War were sown. A rustle of paper from a nearby office, a distant echo of boots on the stairwell, a fleeting shadow slipping behind a curtain, signals, perhaps, of an observer or a messenger. Penkovsky paused, the air thick with possibility, the quiet hum of tension filling the space between breaths. Tomorrow, or perhaps tonight, would demand a choice, a step into uncertainty where every secret could become a weapon, and every ally could conceal a threat. The game had begun, though no one had sounded the first move, and the stakes were already higher than any life could bear alone. The snow fell in silence. The city breathed, tense, waiting. And Oleg Penkovsky, who had survived the crucible of childhood and war, felt for the first time the subtle thrill of a life on the knife's edge, where loyalty, morality, and survival were no longer simple equations, and where the next whisper, the next glance, the next choice might decide the fate of the world. In the cold gray of dawn, the story of a double agent had only just begun, and the world was unknowingly poised on the precipice of history. Every snow-laden street, every dimly lit office, carried a quiet tension he could not shake. Loyalty and curiosity tugged at him in equal measure, and a faint, unspoken question lingered. Could one man's choices tip the balance of nations? The shadows of suspicion were closing, and soon his first steps into the dangerous world of espionage would begin. The corridors of the GRU hummed with the soft rhythm of footsteps, paper sliding across desks, the occasional cough echoing against walls painted in muted shades of gray. To an outsider, the building seemed ordinary, just another government office. But to those who moved within its shadowed halls, it was a living organism, breathing suspicion, secrecy, and discipline. Oleg Penkovsky walked these halls with measured steps, eyes alert, ears attuned, sensing not only the bustle of intelligence work, but the invisible currents of fear and ambition that underlay every interaction. Every colleague, every superior, every whispered conversation was a potential threat, a puzzle, a signal. The Soviet Union had trained him to watch, but life inside the GRU demanded more than observation. It demanded judgment, intuition, and the delicate calibration of loyalty and self-preservation. By 1960, Penkovsky had already earned a reputation for precision, discretion, and intelligence. His tasks were complex but methodical, reviewing reports, analyzing military communications, assessing missile deployment strategies, and coordinating intelligence operations across Europe. Yet, behind each meticulously organized file, each coded transmission, lay a growing awareness of the rigid, unyielding machine he served, a machine that punished questioning and rewarded conformity. He began to notice discrepancies between the ideology preached in the offices and the realities observed in the field, contradictions that gnawed at his conscience like persistent frost seeping through the walls of a poorly insulated apartment. The first whispers of disillusionment were subtle, almost imperceptible. A colleague's offhand comment, a miscalculation swept under the rug, a morally questionable order executed without hesitation. They accumulated like droplets forming a flood. Penkovsky observed these patterns, cataloging the inconsistencies with the same meticulous care he applied to intelligence reports. He realized that within the GRU, information was currency, loyalty was performative, and truth was a malleable tool wielded by those in power. The precision of his work did not shield him from the systemic paranoia that defined Soviet intelligence. Rather, it heightened his awareness that every move he made, every observation he recorded, was both a contribution to and a product of a deeply flawed system. His assignments often took him beyond the borders of Moscow, to satellite offices and listening posts across Eastern Europe. Each city offered new landscapes of power and control, new shades of human behavior filtered through ideology. In Budapest, in Prague, in Warsaw, Penkovsky witnessed the silent weight of surveillance, the unspoken rules enforced by shadowy figures who monitored even their own colleagues. He saw the fear etched into the faces of civilians, the compliance demanded by local authorities, and the quiet suffering of those caught between loyalty to family, country, and ideology. These observations sharpened his understanding of human nature and deepened his unease with the machinery he served. Even within the secure walls of his office, Penkovsky found little comfort. The hum of typewriters, the rustle of paper, the faint creak of chairs, all ordinary sounds, became accomplices to an undercurrent of suspicion. At night, as he lay in his modest apartment, the city outside cloaked in frost and silence, he contemplated the moral compromises demanded by his profession. He understood the stakes. Every secret kept or revealed, every decision made or deferred, had consequences beyond comprehension. And yet, the disillusionment grew, a quiet but persistent gnawing that urged him to question not only the system he served, but his own role within it. The tension inside Penkovsky was mirrored by the geopolitical climate of the era. The Cold War had intensified, the world was a chessboard, and the Soviet Union moved with a combination of precision and unpredictability. Military exercises, missiles tests, and strategic posturing all pointed to the possibility of global confrontation. Within this context, the intelligence gathered by men like Penkovsky was more than information. It was the lifeblood of survival, the difference between strategic advantage and catastrophic miscalculation. Yet, the very system designed to safeguard the nation often obscured truth, rewarded obfuscation, and punished initiative. It was in this crucible that Penkovsky's thoughts began to turn inward. He reflected on the early lessons of childhood, the constant observation, the awareness that any mistake could be fatal, the necessity of discretion and caution, and realized that these instincts were now guiding him toward a more perilous choice, evaluating the morality of loyalty itself. In the quiet, frost-bitten nights, he began to consider a question that few had dared to contemplate in his environment. Could true service to one's country sometimes require breaking the very rules imposed by that country? Could the pursuit of a higher ethical standard justify acts that would otherwise be condemned as treason? The first tangible signs of this moral and intellectual reckoning appeared in small, almost imperceptible actions. Penkovsky began collecting information with a meticulous eye for detail, not only for official reports, but for his own understanding of the broader strategic landscape. He cross-referenced missile capabilities, troop movements, and intelligence from satellite offices, noting discrepancies and patterns that were often ignored by his superiors. In these private observations, he discovered not only the strengths of the Soviet apparatus, but also its vulnerabilities, gaps that, in the hands of others, could be exploited for strategic purposes, or, conversely, could endanger the nation if left unchecked. The duality of Penkovsky's life became increasingly pronounced. In daylight, he was the diligent officer, precise, reliable, and obedient. In shadowed moments, he was the analyst, the observer, the moral evaluator, weighing loyalty against consequence, obedience against conscience. His internal dialogue was a delicate negotiation between fear and curiosity, between duty and skepticism. He began to imagine scenarios in which the intelligence he possessed could be used to prevent catastrophe, to avert miscalculation, to safeguard millions of lives. Yet, such scenarios were dangerous to conceive, let alone act upon, in a system where suspicion was the currency of survival. Encounters with Western diplomats and visiting officials further complicated Penkovsky's internal calculus. He was discreet, measured, careful, and yet he could not entirely suppress curiosity about the world beyond the Soviet sphere. Conversations, however brief and coded, hinted at a global intelligence apparatus operating under a different logic, a system in which information, analysis, and foresight were valued in ways that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy he served. These glimpses were intoxicating, stirring in him a blend of fascination and apprehension, revealing both opportunity and peril. Even as Penkovsky navigated this complex landscape, the machinery of the GRU was relentless. Counterintelligence operations, surveillance sweeps, and internal audits were constant reminders that mistakes could be fatal. Yet, the very constraints imposed upon him heightened his awareness, sharpening his faculties and deepening his capacity for strategic thought. Every file reviewed, every report filed, every observation recorded became both a measure of his skill and a potential test of his judgment. In this crucible, he was learning not only the mechanics of espionage, but the psychology of secrecy, the subtle interplay of fear, loyalty, ambition, and conscience that defined every operative's existence. The pressure was unrelenting, yet Penkovsky thrived in the tension. He developed a heightened sensitivity to human behavior, detecting the subtlest signals of deceit, fear, or intent. A footstep too deliberate in a corridor, a hand lingering too long on a document, a glance that betrayed curiosity. Each detail became a piece of the larger puzzle, a fragment of understanding in a world built on hidden motives. In these observations, he honed not only his analytical abilities, but also his moral compass, learning to discern when obedience served justice and when it masked peril. The stage was now set. Penkovsky's intellectual curiosity and moral reflection had matured into a silent, simmering awareness that his talents and insights could have consequences far beyond his immediate sphere, that intelligence was not merely a tool of the state, but a mechanism capable of shaping history itself. The tension between loyalty and conscience, obedience and morality, had reached a point where inaction was itself a choice with consequences. Every rustle of paper, every whispered meeting, every coded message carried the weight of possibility, the potential to alter the course of nations, and the peril of being caught in the shadows of one's own decisions. And yet, the most dangerous moments were still ahead. Somewhere in the silent, frost-laden streets of Moscow, beyond the watchful eyes of superiors and the familiar hum of the office, the first overtures from the West were forming. They were subtle, careful, almost imperceptible at first, but for a man like Penkovsky, they were signals that the next phase of his life, the phase that would define him in history, was already beginning. He did not yet know the shape of the choices he would face, nor the depths of risk that awaited, but the shadow of possibility had touched him, and he felt the inexorable pull of a path that demanded courage beyond fear, morality beyond obedience, and secrecy beyond imagination. The office lights dimmed, footsteps echoed faintly in the stairwell outside. Penkovsky closed a file, its edges sharp under his fingertips, and leaned back, listening to the city inhale frost and shadow. Somewhere, a whisper of a meeting, A hint of interest, a glimmer of connection was forming, unseen and unspeakable, yet pregnant with consequence. The first move in a game whose rules were unwritten, whose stakes were the survival of nations, and whose outcome rested on the choices of a single, extraordinary man, was quietly approaching. The night pressed against the windows, heavy with tension, heavy with expectation. Penkovsky understood, as he often did in these moments, that the world was waiting, not for him, not yet, but for the consequences of the decisions he would soon make. And in that stillness, that quiet before the storm, he sensed the shift. A turning point had arrived, though its full weight had not yet fallen. The path forward was uncharted, fraught with peril, and irrevocably binding him to a destiny that would reshape the Cold War itself. The footsteps outside stopped. A shadow flickered across the hallway. Somewhere, a door opened and closed in silence. Penkovsky's hand hovered over his pen. Tomorrow, or perhaps tonight, would require more than observation. It would demand action. As he memorized codes and navigated secret meetings, Penkovsky felt the invisible threads of risk tightening around him. Each handoff, each whispered message demanded courage he had yet to measure. And yet, the taste of forbidden knowledge awakened a dangerous curiosity, the kind that could propel him toward a path no ordinary officer would dare to tread. The city of Moscow never truly slept. Beneath its streets, in shadowed alleys and dimly lit cafes, life continued in measured rhythm. Footsteps echoing softly, the distant clatter of tram wheels over frozen tracks, and the muted rustle of coats against harsh winter wind. To most, these were ordinary sounds of an ordinary city. But for Oleg Penkovsky, every noise was a cipher, every shadow a possible observer, every glance an unspoken message. By now, he had long since learned to measure the world not by appearances, but by subtleties. The tension in a shoulder, the hesitation in a syllable, the faint tremor of a hand. It began with whispers, almost imperceptible at first, the softest hints of possibility. Western intelligence had taken note of cracks within the Soviet apparatus, anomalies in reports, slight inconsistencies that suggested more than mere error. They were looking for insight, for someone on the inside who could illuminate the opaque machinery of the GRU. And somewhere, in the maze of observation and calculation, Oleg Penkovsky, adept, observant, morally restless, found himself both target and participant. He had long felt the pull of curiosity, the weight of conscience pressing against the rigid demands of loyalty. Now, that pull became something more urgent, a tangible opportunity, a doorway into a world that had been invisible until now. The first contact was understated, almost ritualistic. A discreet message slipped under a door, an envelope containing instructions as simple as they were dangerous. Attend a meeting, bring nothing, trust no one, be vigilant. The message carried the unmistakable hum of precision, the quiet insistence of someone who understood risk intimately. Penkovsky read it several times, the paper rustling softly in his hands, and felt the familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration, the recognition that his life was about to pivot in ways he could neither fully predict nor control. He arrived at the meeting place with his usual caution, every sense alert, every movement calculated. The room was unremarkable, sparsely furnished, dimly lit, with a single table and 2 chairs. Yet every element was deliberate. The position of the window to obscure shadows, the faint hum of heat radiators to mask sound, the placement of chairs to facilitate observation without appearing intrusive. Across the table sat a man who introduced himself with minimal words, whose eyes flickered with the intelligence of experience, the confidence of someone accustomed to lives and secrets hanging in the balance. "What brings you here?" the man asked, voice calm but taut with implication. The question was ordinary in tone, yet extraordinary in consequence. Penkovsky understood that a single misstep, a single revealing gesture, could undo him entirely. He responded with measured honesty, revealing enough to indicate awareness and capability, but withholding any hint of motivation or intent that could betray caution. The conversation proceeded in rhythms designed to disarm, to probe, to test. Subtle shifts in posture, nuanced questioning, the occasional pause that spoke volumes. Each second stretched, pregnant with possibility and peril. It was a delicate dance. Penkovsky listened as carefully as he spoke, noting the cadence of words, the weight of each pause, the unspoken assurances hidden between syllables. The operative across the table, representing MI6 and later the CIA, recognized in him a rare combination: intelligence, discretion, and moral awareness. It was one thing to be capable. It was another to possess the subtle psychological acuity required to navigate not only the logistics of espionage, but the labyrinth of human trust, suspicion, and ideology. Penkovsky in that room understood both risks and potential with crystal clarity. Over weeks, the meetings multiplied, each carefully orchestrated to test reliability and resolve. Dead drops became exercises in precision, clandestine handoffs a study in nerves and timing. The city around him remained unaware of the high-stakes game being played in quiet rooms, behind curtains, in shadowed alleys. Even ordinary sounds, the hum of a tram, the soft murmur of neighbors, the distant footsteps of a sentry, were loaded with meaning, each capable of masking danger or signaling opportunity. Every choice was life-altering, every moment a measure of courage and caution. Penkovsky's decisions were not made lightly. He weighed the consequences with the exacting rigor of an analyst, recognizing that every secret he revealed could prevent catastrophe, or, if discovered prematurely, ensure his own destruction. He understood the paradox. Loyalty to conscience might demand betrayal of country. Obedience to authority could perpetuate disaster. His moral calculus was complex, private, and unrelenting, guiding him through encounters that were as psychological as they were practical. As he supplied carefully curated intelligence, missile specifications, deployment schedules, troop movements, the West gained insight into Soviet capabilities previously obscured by layers of secrecy and deception. Each document, each observation, was a thread woven into a broader tapestry of understanding, enabling decisions in Washington and London that might avert disaster. Penkovsky became a conduit of knowledge, a silent arbiter of risk, a man whose calculations could shape the fate of millions. Yet the risk was omnipresent. Within the GRU, the mechanisms of counterintelligence were precise and merciless. The smallest anomaly in behavior could trigger suspicion. The faintest deviation from routine could be recorded, analyzed, and traced. Penkovsky navigated this minefield with practiced care, masking curiosity with compliance, subtlety with discipline. He knew that discovery would mean execution, not only for him but for the fragile network of operatives who depended on his discretion. The city outside slept, unaware, as one man moved in perpetual tension, the weight of history pressing invisibly against his shoulders. The psychological strain was immense. Each night, he lay awake, listening to the muted hum of Moscow, the distant clatter of trams, the soft echo of boots on icy streets, the faint whisper of wind against frosted windows, and contemplated the magnitude of what he had undertaken. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams in which corridors twisted impossibly, doors led to nowhere, and shadows seemed alive with intent. Yet, even in these restless hours, he remained resolute, guided by a principle that was as personal as it was perilous. The pursuit of truth, tempered by conscience, demanded action. In time, Penkovsky began to grasp the broader implications of his choices. His intelligence did not merely inform, it shaped strategic thinking at the highest levels, influencing deliberations that might avert nuclear confrontation or precipitate global conflict. The responsibility was staggering, yet he bore it with meticulous care, aware that errors could be catastrophic, and that revelation, even to those who would later reward him, could be fatal. The duality of his life had reached a point of acute tension. Outwardly, the obedient officer, inwardly, the conduit of history, the guardian of secrets that could tip the scales of civilization. And yet, the most perilous moments remained ahead. The act of collaboration was only the beginning. Soon, Penkovsky would confront not only the strategic consequences of his intelligence, but the human consequences: suspicion, betrayal, surveillance, and the inexorable scrutiny of his own conscience. Each meeting, each Hecate handoff, each observation carried the potential for disaster, the possibility of exposure, the chilling certainty that any misstep could end everything. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware that in quiet rooms behind closed doors, a single man's choices were shaping the world in ways that history would only later fully reveal. A faint creak on the stairwell, the subtle shuffle of footsteps approaching, a shadow cast across the frosted windowpane. These ordinary cues became profound signals. Penkovsky paused, breath held, every sense alert, knowing that at any moment the delicate equilibrium could shatter. The West had extended its hand, cautiously, tentatively. The GRU's eyes were vigilant, unyielding. He stood between worlds, a bridge built of secrecy, intelligence, and conscience, carrying the weight of knowledge that could avert catastrophe or invite it. In that quiet, frost-laden room, Oleg Penkovsky understood the full scope of the game he had entered. The first handshake with MI6, the initial notes passed, the careful, coded conversations, all were more than espionage. They were acts that would echo across continents, across governments, across time. He was no longer merely a participant in the machinery of the Soviet state. He was a pivotal actor in the unfolding drama of the Cold War, a man whose intellect, courage, and morality would intersect with history at the highest stakes imaginable. And as he left the meeting, footsteps muffled by snow, a letter carefully concealed beneath his coat, the city around him seemed both familiar and transformed. Every shadow might conceal an observer. Every whisper might carry danger. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat became a negotiation with fate. The first moves had been made and the board was set. The game of secrets, survival, and consequence was underway, and the world, unaware, unprepared, was already shifting under the weight of one man's choices. The cold Moscow wind bit at his face, the distant lights of the city flickering against frozen streets, and Penkovsky realized that the path ahead was a perilous tightrope, a balance of courage and caution, morality and loyalty, life and the very real possibility of death. He could not yet know the full consequences of his actions, but the die had been cast. The shadowed corridors of espionage had welcomed him, and there was no turning back. Night after night, Penkovsky's mind weighed every calculation, every observation, every secret tucked away in memory. The thrill of insight was inseparable from the peril that stalked him, and an uneasy thought lingered. How far could he go before discovery became inevitable? The answers lay in the next assignments that would test his loyalty and resolve in ways he had never imagined. The corridors of the GRU were colder than the Moscow streets, if only by degrees of scrutiny. Every door was a gate into a world where mistakes could echo beyond the walls, beyond the city, perhaps even beyond the nation itself. Oleg Penkovsky moved through them with the calm precision of a man trained to survive the quiet scrutiny of authority. But beneath that calm, a tempest of thought and tension churned, unseen yet ever present. Each footstep echoed with consequence. Each glance across a crowded office carried potential peril. Within the heart of Soviet intelligence, he had become a man both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in manner, extraordinary in knowledge and foresight. By now, Penkovsky had established a rhythm, a clandestine pattern invisible to those around him. Documents were reviewed, notes taken, files cross-checked, all under the outward guise of diligent service. Inside, however, each piece of information was cataloged, analyzed, and memorized with a precision that transcended the ordinary. Missile schematics, troop movements, nuclear protocols, everything became part of a mental map, a latticework of understanding that he alone could navigate with both clarity and discretion. The knowledge was intoxicating, but it carried a shadow heavier than any winter night in Moscow. Every revelation was a risk, every act of intelligence gathering a tightrope over the abyss of exposure. The city outside remained indifferent. Snow fell in muffled silence. Tram wheels whispered over icy rails, and the faint hum of electricity coursed through street lamps. But within the offices of the GRU, tension was a constant presence. Supervisors walked the halls with deliberate steps, eyes scanning, ears attuned, suspicion woven into every interaction. Penkovsky had learned to read the signals, the subtle tightening of a jaw, the almost imperceptible pause in a conversation, the fleeting glance that might betray curiosity or concern. Every meeting, every document, every interaction was a test of nerves and calculation. He knew the machinery of counterintelligence would not tolerate hesitation, oversight, or error. In these conditions, Penkovsky's mind thrived on discipline and structure, yet also wandered into the dangerous terrain of moral reflection. He observed the world around him, the loyalty that masked fear, the obedience that concealed doubt, the rituals of conformity that preserved survival, and understood that his own life existed at the intersection of these forces. To navigate this space required more than intellect. It demanded courage, self-awareness, and the constant weighing of risk against necessity. He was, in a very real sense, balancing on the edge of history, carrying knowledge that could avert disaster or provoke catastrophe. The intelligence he gathered was precise, unparalleled in clarity. For months, he memorized the inner workings of Soviet missile programs, the strategic layouts of nuclear arsenals, the intricate choreography of troop deployments. Each detail he recalled, each schematic reconstructed, each protocol noted in secret became a lifeline for Western analysts. The CIA and MI6, working with fragments of Penkovsky's insights, began to visualize the true scope of the Soviet threat in ways that had previously been impossible. He had become not merely an informant, but a conduit of historical consequence, a man whose mental maps and careful documentation could alter the calculations of presidents and generals. Yet the stakes were impossible to overstate. In the GRU, even the smallest inconsistency could trigger an internal investigation. Surveillance was omnipresent. A silent predator moving through hallways and stairwells, listening in whispers, noting patterns. Penkovsky's every interaction carried potential danger. He developed a keen sense of timing and distance, learning to leave documents precisely where they would be found, to speak only in necessary phrases, to mask curiosity as obedience. The ordinary act of living had become a series of performances, each calibrated to avoid suspicion while preserving the flow of intelligence critical to the world beyond Moscow's frost-laden streets. His dual life was exhausting, yet he embraced it with the meticulous care of an artisan. Days were spent within the institutional routines of the GRU, nights in careful reflection, memorization, and planning. He would rehearse scenarios quietly, imagining contingencies and consequences, considering the cascade of effects that each piece of information might provoke if revealed too soon, too late, or incompletely. Every rustle of paper, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast in the lamplight was a note in the symphony of secrecy that he conducted alone. Even small moments were fraught with tension. A hand extended to retrieve a document, a conversation diverted to the trivial, a pause in the corridor, each could betray a deviation from expected behavior. Penkovsky's life had become a continuous negotiation with uncertainty, a careful balancing of moral duty, personal survival, and historical consequence. His awareness of the stakes never dulled. It was a constant companion, sometimes oppressive, sometimes galvanizing, but always present. He observed colleagues not merely for operational insight, but for psychological patterns, noting how fear influenced decisions, how loyalty was performed, how ambition could obscure judgment. Every micro-expression, every subtle hesitation, every choice made under scrutiny contributed to his understanding of human behavior under pressure. In this, Penkovsky's intelligence work became inseparable from his study of the human condition, and in turn, from the moral calculus that would guide his decisions in the months ahead. The flow of intelligence from Moscow to London and Washington increased in both volume and importance. Each memorandum, each sketch, each observation became a lifeline of understanding in the growing crisis that would culminate in Cuba. Penkovsky's knowledge of missile capabilities, their range, and deployment patterns provided unprecedented clarity to Western strategists. Every carefully memorized diagram, every nuanced report, every observation of Soviet military readiness fed into contingency planning that might save millions of lives, or fail catastrophically if discovered too late. Yet, the deeper he sank into the work, the more the risk magnified. He was aware that the smallest breach of routine, the faintest signal of deviation, could trigger scrutiny. The GRU's counterintelligence division, relentless and thorough, watched for anomalies in behavior, discrepancies in documentation, even subtle changes in tone. Penkovsky's skill lay in masking the extraordinary as ordinary, rendering his dual life invisible through discipline, timing, and psychological acuity. The stakes were existential. Every day, he balanced knowledge, risk, and morality on the edge of a knife. Beyond the technical intelligence, Penkovsky also navigated relationships within the GRU, mentors, subordinates, superiors, each a potential vector of risk or insight. He learned to calibrate social interactions as carefully as operational decisions, masking curiosity and insight behind a facade of conformity. Small gestures, casual comments, shared observations, all were measured for potential consequence. In this invisible theater, he became an actor in a drama that required constant vigilance, constant calculation, constant moral attention. The approach of 1962 brought new tension. Global intelligence, already tense, was converging on a single point: Cuba. The Soviet Union's missile deployments were underway, their secrecy maintained through layers of operational discipline and deception. For Penkovsky, the pressure intensified. Each observation could be critical. Each handoff could determine the fate of nations. He began to move beyond routine reporting, preparing detailed sketches, reconstructing deployment strategies in his mind, and memorizing every nuance of missile range, positioning, and readiness. The knowledge he carried was both a weapon and a shield, capable of preventing disaster or incurring catastrophe. In the quiet hours of early winter nights, he would pace his apartment, listening to the faint hum of electricity, the distant clatter of streetcars, the soft echo of boots on frozen pavement. His thoughts oscillated between fear and resolve, calculation and conscience. He understood that discovery would mean immediate execution, and yet inaction could permit catastrophe on a global scale. The moral and psychological tension was constant, almost suffocating, yet it sharpened his faculties and crystallized his purpose. Knowledge must be wielded wisely, risk must be measured precisely, and secrecy must be absolute. And so he continued, navigating the machinery of the Soviet state with a subtlety that few could match. Each day was a study in vigilance, every night a rehearsal of foresight. He knew that one misstep could unravel not only his life, but the delicate balance of the Cold War itself. The corridors of Moscow became both classroom and battlefield, each document a lesson, each observation a weapon. In these months, Penkovsky became something greater than an officer or an agent. He became a fulcrum of history, a man whose knowledge and judgment might shape the fate of millions. As winter deepened and snow blanketed the streets, he felt the weight of history settle firmly on his shoulders. The world outside Moscow remained unaware of the intricate web of observation, courage, and moral calculation being woven within a single man. Yet, in his mind, the contours of global conflict were clear. The missiles, the deployments, the chain of command, the strategic calculations, all converged in a silent, lethal tension. Penkovsky had become a living bridge between secrecy and revelation, a keeper of truths that could alter the course of human history. And somewhere, beyond the frost and shadows, Western intelligence awaited the full measure of his contributions. Every handoff, every report, every observation carried weight. The stakes were unprecedented. The countdown to the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War had begun, and Penkovsky's actions would soon place him directly at the heart of the world's most perilous crisis. The snow fell in muffled silence. Footsteps echoed faintly on frozen streets. A door clicked shut somewhere in the city. Penkovsky paused, listening, sensing the invisible tension pressing in from every angle. The game had deepened. The stakes had escalated, and the world, still unaware, was on the brink. The first real brush with danger left a lingering tension that refused to fade. Every glance over his shoulder, every cautious step, reminded him that one miscalculation could end everything. And yet, the game had begun, and the threads of espionage were tightening, leading him deeper into a world where trust was scarce and betrayal could come from any corner. October 1962 arrived in Moscow with an unrelenting chill, each morning heavier with frost and uncertainty, each evening darker with shadows that seemed to creep deeper into streets and offices. Oleg Penkovsky moved through the corridors of the GRU with the practiced calm of a man whose life depended on invisibility. Yet, beneath that calm surged an awareness of the storm gathering across continents. The Cold War had intensified, the nuclear chessboard was set, and he was a pawn, and perhaps a king, in a game whose stakes could not be measured. The intelligence he carried was no longer abstract. Reports, sketches, and calculations had coalesced into a concrete understanding. Soviet medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles were being deployed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast. Every piece of information he had painstakingly memorized, every subtle observation made in Moscow offices and satellite installations, now had the potential to avert global catastrophe, or accelerate it. The tension was almost unbearable. Even the faintest sound, a whisper in a corridor, the click of a radiator, the scuff of boots on frost-hardened pavement, seemed to reverberate with consequence. Penetrating the veil of Soviet secrecy had always been perilous, but the Cuban crisis elevated risk to an almost unthinkable level. Penkovsky knew that the moment the GRU or KGB suspected his actions, there would be no trial, no negotiation, no room for error. Death would be immediate, and his role as a conduit for information, critical to the survival of millions, would end abruptly. Yet, he persisted, his resolve sharpened by the knowledge that every encoded message, every memorized deployment diagram, every nuanced detail of missile readiness could allow the West to act decisively. He carried his intelligence with care, often memorizing entire deployment maps, range calculations, and technical specifications, passing only the barest fragments in written form when absolutely necessary. Each meeting with Western contacts was a tense choreography, locations chosen for privacy, times calculated to avoid detection, signals subtle but unmistakable. A folded newspaper, a pencil mark on a wall, a slip of paper concealed beneath a table, all were vehicles for history in miniature. Each act required both nerve and precision, and every breath carried the weight of consequence. Penkovsky understood the enormity of his role. The United States, under President John F. Kennedy, was now grappling with intelligence that would define the response to the missile deployments. Analysts relied on fragments pieced together from aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and the intelligence he supplied. The combination of these insights gave policymakers the clarity needed to calibrate their response, to prepare for blockade or negotiation, and to calculate the likelihood of Soviet escalation. One misstep, one incorrect detail, and the world could descend into unimaginable conflict. Moscow itself was a web of suspicion. GRU officers patrolled the halls with deliberate eyes. Colleagues observed one another under the unrelenting gaze of ideology, and counterintelligence officers watched for the faintest anomalies. Penkovsky's double life demanded constant vigilance, a psychological endurance rivaling the physical. At night, in his apartment overlooking snow-covered streets, he would replay each handoff, each observation, each interaction, mentally tracing pathways, imagining consequences, and rehearsing contingencies. Even a cough, a footstep, or the soft rustle of a curtain could be a signal, a threat, or an opportunity. The weeks of the crisis were a study in tension, each day stretching into nights that were punctuated by calculation and anxiety. Penkovsky became acutely aware of the global stakes. A misstep by leaders unaware of the true capabilities of Soviet missiles could precipitate nuclear annihilation. The intelligence he carried, carefully memorized, painstakingly verified, and subtly transmitted, was now a cornerstone of the Kennedy administration's decision-making. Every detail mattered: the location of launchers, the readiness of missiles, the potential reaction time for Soviet forces, the political calculations behind Khrushchev's deployments. His interactions with Western contacts were marked by a quiet intensity. Messages were exchanged with near-surgical precision, dead drops executed with exact timing, and conversations conducted in whispers, or in the coded language of subtle gesture. Each encounter demanded total presence. A single misstep could unravel weeks of careful planning. Penkovsky's training, intelligence, and moral discipline were tested relentlessly, but the stakes, averted nuclear war, the preservation of millions of lives, sustained him through the exhaustion and fear. The Cuban Missile Crisis reached its peak in late October, and Penkovsky's intelligence was central to understanding the Soviet position. The missiles in Cuba were confirmed to be operational, the potential launch windows calculated, and the strategic impact assessed. This information allowed Kennedy and his advisors to calibrate a naval blockade, to negotiate with Khrushchev with the leverage of accurate, verified intelligence, and to communicate a measured but firm response. The world was on the brink, and a single agent in Moscow, memorizing and transmitting details that no one else could access, was a linchpin in the prevention of global catastrophe. Even as the crisis eased through careful negotiation, Penkovsky's awareness of personal danger intensified. Every transmission, every meeting, every document had been a gamble with existential stakes. Now, with Khrushchev's eventual withdrawal of missiles, the immediate threat receded, but the GRU's scrutiny did not. Suspicion lingered in hallways, whispers floated through offices, and the shadow of exposure remained a constant companion. Penkovsky's relief was tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of espionage, the post-crisis reckoning, was still ahead. In quiet reflection, he understood that the Cuban Missile Crisis had transformed his role. He was no longer merely an officer within the GRU, he was a man whose choices had shaped history. The tension of risk, the psychological burden of secrecy, and the moral weight of decision had placed him at the center of events that could have destroyed the world. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was now colored by the awareness that history watched, unseen but inexorably, and that the balance of life and death rested on his vigilance. And yet, danger loomed even after the world exhaled in relief. The GRU and KGB remained vigilant, counterintelligence operations intensified, and Penkovsky's own colleagues were trained to detect subtle anomalies that might expose his duplicity. His life was a narrow corridor of survival, lined with unseen observers, invisible threats, and moral decisions that would haunt him for years. Every rustle of paper, every echo of footsteps, every shadow passing his window became a potential signal, a silent reminder of the ever-present risk that history and bureaucracy had imposed upon him. The streets of Moscow were quiet now, snow reflecting the pale glow of street lamps. Penkovsky paused at his apartment window, listening to the faint scrape of a shovel clearing ice, the distant clatter of tram tracks, the soft sigh of wind against buildings. He realized that the Cuban Gambit, the crisis he had helped to avert, had shifted the world, but it had not freed him. The stakes remained high, the risk immediate, and the consequences of discovery absolute. Yet, in this quiet moment, he allowed himself a fragile recognition. The knowledge he carried, the courage he displayed, had made a difference, however invisible to the untrained eye. The night pressed in. A door creaked somewhere in the building. Footsteps echoed in the corridor below. Somewhere, a shadow moved against the frost-tinged light. Penkovsky's hand rested lightly on a file, his mind alert, his conscience alive. The crisis had passed, but the game of espionage continued, with new threats, new risks, and new moral dilemmas. The balance he maintained was delicate, precarious, and profoundly consequential. With each diagram memorized, each missile site accounted for, the stakes rose higher than he had ever known. The intelligence he carried could avert catastrophe, or, if misused, unleash it. The weight of his choices pressed on him relentlessly, foreshadowing a period where every secret held life and death consequences, both for him and the entire world. The city of Moscow had a way of compressing fear into ordinary moments. The muted creak of a floorboard, the faint scratch of a pen on paper, even the soft footsteps of a colleague could carry implications heavier than lead. For Oleg Penkovsky, the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis brought not relief, but an intensification of peril. The world outside had exhaled in cautious relief, yet, within the halls of the GRU and KGB, vigilance hardened into suspicion. The crisis had revealed the limitations of intelligence, the gaps in observation, and the faintest anomalies in behavior could now attract scrutiny that might unravel months of careful concealment. Penkovsky felt it first as a subtle tension in the air. A glance held slightly too long in the corridor, a question phrased with unusual precision, the near imperceptible hesitation of an officer handling a report. The machinery of counterintelligence had not slept. It had only paused briefly, then resumed with renewed intensity. Every action, every gesture, every routine step through Moscow streets became a measured risk. Even the simplest act, retrieving a file, closing a door, or walking across a frost-covered courtyard, required calculation, rehearsal, and discipline. He had long known the danger of exposure, but now the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. The GRU began auditing reports with heightened scrutiny. Analysts who had once moved in predictable patterns were now questioned about discrepancies, omissions, and anomalies. Documents previously accepted without note were examined under the microscope of suspicion. Penkovsky, aware of the delicate tightrope he navigated, adjusted his behavior with precision, masking insight as routine diligence. He carried the weight of information that could avert nuclear catastrophe, yet each day the shadow of discovery pressed closer. The quiet, disciplined life he had maintained was suddenly vulnerable to the tiniest misstep. The psychological strain was relentless. At night, in his modest apartment, Penkovsky listened to the city breathe beneath frost-laden skies, the distant rattle of trams over icy tracks, the soft scraping of shovels clearing sidewalks, the subtle sigh of wind through frost-stiffened trees. These ordinary sounds became reminders of surveillance, of proximity, of unseen observation. Even sleep offered no refuge. Dreams were layered with corridors of possibility, shadows that moved of their own accord, and threats that emerged from imagined whispers. The moral and emotional weight of secrecy pressed down with almost physical force, demanding vigilance and resolve beyond human comfort. His Western contacts became more critical than ever, but every handoff now carried amplified risk. Dead drops had to be recalibrated, timings adjusted with obsessive precision, signals re-evaluated for potential exposure. The flow of intelligence, already delicate, required ever greater cunning to maintain. Penkovsky knew that the slightest deviation, a misremembered code, a miscalculated signal, could trigger detection and collapse not only his network, but the strategic advantage he had helped create. The stakes were existential. Suspicion grew within the GRU itself. Officers noted patterns of behavior that seemed unusual, small inconsistencies in schedules or routines. Every corridor, every office, every common area could conceal observation. Penkovsky relied on intuition honed over years, reading the micro-expressions of colleagues, the rhythm of footsteps in stairwells, the subtle cadence of conversation. He became a master of disguise in ordinary life, projecting diligence and conformity while hiding a mind alive with analysis and moral calculation. Pressure mounted as counterintelligence intensified surveillance. Penkovsky was aware that even a casual remark, an overlooked document, or an unusual glance could signal risk. He moved through Moscow streets and GRU offices like a shadow, blending with the rhythm of the city, yet carrying within him the invisible load of knowledge whose exposure could provoke immediate reprisal, or a cascade of geopolitical disaster. Each day was a rehearsal in restraint, discretion, and psychological endurance. The stakes were not only operational, but deeply personal. Penkovsky reflected on the potential consequences of discovery for his family, friends, and colleagues. Any misstep could result in arrest, imprisonment, or execution, not only for him but for those unknowingly tied to his actions. Every handshake, every conversation, every moment of ordinary life carried the latent threat of ruin. His awareness sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. No detail was too small, no signal too trivial to escape consideration. Even as he navigated these dangers, Penkovsky's contributions remained vital. Intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities, troop deployments, and nuclear readiness continued to flow to London and Washington. Each memorandum, each carefully memorized diagram, each whispered observation contributed to a global understanding that might prevent catastrophe. But the personal cost of this service intensified. The constant vigilance, the psychological strain, the moral tension, and the unrelenting risk of exposure pressed on him like a living weight. Within the GRU, subtle investigations began to converge, a tightening web of observation and doubt. Colleagues noted anomalies, a question answered with too much precision, a file referenced too frequently, a hesitation or flourish in behavior that did not align with expectation. Penkovsky responded with flawless composure, masking knowledge as routine diligence, insight as ordinary habit. Yet, he knew the pressure was now acute. The network of surveillance, both formal and informal, was closing in, and the possibility of discovery was immediate. Night after night, he rehearsed contingencies, imagined confrontations, rapid evasions, subtle manipulations of documents, silent signals to Western contacts. Each scenario carried ethical, operational, and existential weight. The mind of the spy became both shield and burden, a repository of secret knowledge, strategic foresight, and moral deliberation. Penkovsky balanced on a razor's edge where the cost of miscalculation was death and the cost of inaction might be history itself. And then, the subtle shifts began. Mislaid documents noticed by colleagues, casual inquiries that probed too deeply, the almost imperceptible tightening of supervision. The danger was no longer hypothetical, it was imminent. The GRU's counterintelligence apparatus, relentless in its logic, was circling, and Penkovsky's careful equilibrium faced its ultimate test. Every decision, every observation, every breath was now a measure of survival, strategy, and conscience. In the frost-bitten silence of Moscow nights, Penkovsky sensed the closing of a chapter in his life. The Cuban Missile Crisis had passed, but the consequences of his actions had left him vulnerable, exposed to the scrutiny of a system built to punish deviation. He realized that history had placed him at the center of a moral and operational storm, and the next moments, weeks, perhaps days, would determine not only his fate, but the integrity of the intelligence network he had built. Footsteps echoed faintly outside his apartment. A shadow flickered across the frosted window. Somewhere, a door closed with the deliberate precision of authority. Penkovsky held his breath, hand resting lightly on a carefully hidden file, mind alive with contingency plans, calculations, and moral reflection. The game of espionage had entered its most dangerous phase, and the consequences of discovery, long imagined in abstract terms, were now concrete, immediate, and suffocatingly real. The eyes of suspicion were everywhere, yet still he moved with precision, aware that one wrong step could unravel everything. Fear mingled with resolve, and the delicate balance of his double life began to crack. The looming threat of discovery was only the beginning. The true test of courage and consequence was still ahead, waiting in the cold corridors of interrogation. The winter streets of Moscow offered no comfort, only the relentless hush of frost and the weight of anticipation. Oleg Penkovsky moved through them as always, outwardly calm, inwardly alert to every shadow, every whisper, every step that might betray him. But now, the invisible pressure pressing from the corridors of GRU and KGB offices had transformed from subtle suspicion into a tightening noose. Intelligence, once a shield and a weapon, had become a magnet drawing scrutiny, danger, and inevitability toward him. It began with small disruptions in routine, an unexpected inquiry about a seemingly trivial report. A supervisor lingering near his desk, asking questions with unusual specificity. Files requested for review without warning. Penkovsky felt the subtle shift, the narrowing circle, and he knew with a certainty that chilled every nerve, that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The game of shadows, of secret notes and silent observation, was about to collide with the reality of exposure. He attempted to maintain composure, moving through the GRU offices as if nothing had changed. Yet, every glance, every step, every casual interaction carried the unbearable weight of possibility. What if a colleague noticed a hesitation, a glance too precise, a knowledge too complete? What if counterintelligence had pieced together the fragments of truth, tracing the faint lines that connected his actions to the flow of Western intelligence? The margin for error had vanished, leaving only the razor's edge of survival. Then, one evening, the noose tightened visibly. Footsteps approached his apartment door with an unfamiliar cadence, deliberate and precise. A knock, polite yet unyielding, resonated through the narrow hallway. Penkovsky froze, every muscle taut, every thought rehearsed over countless nights, now converging in a single, critical instant. The door opened, and the figures of men in dark coats stepped into the threshold, silent, unrelenting, the embodiment of the machinery he had evaded for months. The arrest was swift, almost clinical. Penkovsky's protests were unnecessary. Resistance would have been both futile and fatal. They moved with the efficiency of trained professionals, hands guided by procedure, eyes scanning for subtle signs of concealment. Every step of the journey, from the apartment, through frost-laden streets, into the shadowed vehicle, and across the city, was marked by the quiet hum of inevitability. Each sound, the crunch of snow underfoot, the muted shift of seats, the distant hum of Moscow traffic, was magnified, each echo a reminder of mortality and consequence. In the cold, stark interrogation rooms of the GRU, Penkovsky confronted the most dangerous dimension of espionage, the human mind under pressure. Questions came in measured, relentless sequences, voices calm but edged with steel. Evidence was presented with precision, contradictions highlighted, motives dissected. And through it all, Penkovsky maintained an outward composure, masking terror and calculation behind a veneer of controlled rationality. Yet, inside, the mind was a storm, weighing options, gauging risk, calculating outcomes, always aware that one slip could seal fate irrevocably. The interrogations were psychological as much as procedural. Silence, subtle suggestion, the strategic placement of documents, all were weapons. Penkovsky, a master of observation, recognized the tactics: isolation, repetition, pressure, moral insinuation. He responded with careful discipline, neither conceding nor overtly defying, navigating a labyrinth of manipulation designed to break resistance. Each question was a probe, each pause a test, each glance an assessment of vulnerability. The dance of intellect and survival had never been more intense, nor more perilous. The trial, when it came, was as swift as it was inevitable. Proceedings were formal, yet orchestrated with the unrelenting efficiency of a state machinery accustomed to producing predetermined outcomes. Evidence of espionage, meticulously catalogued and presented, left little room for doubt in the eyes of the court. Penkovsky's defense was limited, constrained by both legal procedure and the omnipresent risk of revealing additional intelligence. He moved through the trial with the same precision that had defined his intelligence work, understanding that composure could preserve dignity even in the shadow of condemnation. Throughout, the psychological toll was immense. Each session, each accusation, each silent glance from the bench or gallery reinforced the dual reality he faced, that of the man who had shaped history in the shadows, and that of the individual now fully exposed to the apparatus of justice he had long navigated from behind a veil of secrecy. The weight of responsibility, guilt, and moral consequence pressed heavily, yet he bore it with the quiet resilience that had characterized every moment of his double life. Outside the courtrooms and interrogation rooms, the world was unaware of the intimate drama unfolding. The Cuban Missile Crisis had passed, yet its echoes lingered, entwined with Penkovsky's fate. Every document, every observation, every memorized detail now carried consequences both personal and geopolitical. The tension of months compressed into hours of exposure as the machinery of state met the human intellect that had once eluded it. The judgment was final, a sentence delivered with a cold precision that mirrored the state's unyielding logic. Penkovsky faced it with the same measured calm that had carried him through years of secret peril. Yet, within, he understood the magnitude of history. His choices, his courage, his intelligence had altered the trajectory of the world, even as his personal fate hung in the balance. The dichotomy of triumph and tragedy became stark, inescapable, and profound. Even as he was escorted from the courtroom, footsteps echoing against marble and stone, the mind of Oleg Penkovsky remained alive, calculating, remembering, enduring. Each sound, each gesture, each shadow held meaning, carrying with it lessons of survival, insight, and consequence. The human cost of espionage had become immediate, tangible, and undeniable. And yet, amidst the fear and finality, a quiet awareness persisted. The work he had done, the intelligence he had supplied, had shaped events that might otherwise have ended in catastrophe. In the darkness of confinement, the distant hum of Moscow streets filtered through walls and windows. Penkovsky reflected on a life lived in shadows, in whispers, in silence. The double life had brought peril, moral tension, and the weight of history. Yet, it had also preserved millions from the abyss, had provided clarity in moments of unimaginable uncertainty, and had forced a confrontation with the deepest complexities of conscience and courage. And as he sat alone, footsteps fading into distant corridors, the faint whisper of the wind against frozen windows, Penkovsky understood that while the state might hold him, history had not. His actions had shaped the trajectory of nations, had altered decisions at the highest levels, and had preserved a fragile balance in the face of unprecedented danger. The reckoning was personal, immediate, and absolute, but the legacy of intelligence, courage, and conscience was already quietly inscribed in the course of world events. As the doors of the GRU closed behind him and the courtroom sketches etched themselves into history, Penkovsky's life hung by a slender thread. Every whispered accusation and every shadowed glance reminded him that espionage had its price. And though his fate seemed sealed, the story of his influence on history had only begun to unfold. The corridors of history are seldom silent. Even decades later, the echoes of decisions made in shadowed offices, the faint traces of whispers exchanged in Moscow alleys, the rustle of papers folded and passed in careful secrecy, linger like ghosts. Oleg Penkovsky's life, brief and perilous, existed in that liminal space between action and consequence, courage and exposure, secrecy and revelation. His story, though marked by personal peril, resonates far beyond the walls of the GRU, beyond the frost-laden streets of Moscow, and into the collective memory of the Cold War itself. Penkovsky's intelligence had altered the course of October 1962, when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, that perilous confrontation between superpowers, could have ended in catastrophe. Yet, thanks to the detailed, painstakingly memorized, and subtly transmitted information he provided, Western policymakers, Kennedy and his advisors, were able to understand the scope of the Soviet missile deployment with unprecedented clarity. Every missile location, every deployment schematic, every operational nuance he observed contributed to a strategy that preserved life and averted disaster. History in that moment had leaned upon a single human mind, trained, disciplined, and courageous. Yet Penkovsky's legacy is not merely the avoidance of nuclear war. It lies in the moral architecture of espionage itself. He inhabited the liminal space between obedience to state and allegiance to conscience, demonstrating the terrifying and extraordinary weight of personal ethical choice within the machinery of geopolitics. Each handoff of information was a negotiation not only with risk, but with morality, an act that demanded courage far beyond the ordinary. He risked death for the sake of knowledge, and through that knowledge, he shaped the decisions of leaders far above his own rank and station. In Moscow, the aftermath of his arrest and trial left reverberations still felt within the corridors of intelligence. Counterintelligence operations intensified, procedures hardened, and the shadow of Penkovsky's infiltration served as a cautionary tale. For colleagues and successors, he became an unspoken measure of vigilance, a reminder that human intelligence, subtlety, and conscience could pierce even the most opaque systems. His existence and the information he carried revealed the limits of control, the fragility of secrecy, and the latent potential of an individual to influence global destiny. Meanwhile, the West integrated his contributions into a broader understanding of Soviet capabilities. Analysts, strategists, and historians later pieced together the intricate lattice of intelligence he had provided, recognizing the clarity it brought to crises that could have ended in annihilation. Penkovsky became both known and anonymous, a figure whose identity was celebrated in secret, whose actions were acknowledged in classified corridors, yet whose life remained largely obscured to public view. The paradox of his legacy was as delicate as the balance he had preserved, an invisible hand shaping the fate of nations. Psychologically, the cost of such a life weighed heavily. Years of double consciousness, simultaneously performing obedience and rebellion, surveillance and subversion, loyalty and betrayal, carved deep trenches in Penkovsky's mind. The constant tension, the unceasing vigilance, the moral calculations that accompanied every decision, all left a mark that neither history nor accolades could erase. He embodied the human cost of espionage, the solitude, the fear, the ethical complexity, and the intimate knowledge of mortality. The ripple effects of his work extended into strategy, policy, and diplomacy. His intelligence directly informed blockade decisions, negotiation strategies, and contingency planning. When the Soviet missiles in Cuba were eventually withdrawn, it was not merely political calculation at work. It was precise understanding of capabilities, deployment, and intent, shaped in no small measure by the efforts of one man walking cautiously through Moscow's corridors, aware of every eye, every footstep, every shadow. Yet, beyond strategy and crisis management, Penkovsky's story endures as a meditation on courage, choice, and historical responsibility. He demonstrated that even within systems designed to suppress individual initiative, even in environments where deviation could mean death, a single human being could exercise judgment, foresight, and conscience with consequences that reverberate across decades. The corridors of Moscow, the offices of the GRU, and the streets he walked have long since faded from view, but the imprint of his actions endures in history, in policy, and in the lives spared by his courage. For the historians who later reconstruct these events, the story is both extraordinary and unsettling. It forces reflection on the ethical terrain of espionage, When is risk justified? When is secrecy necessary? When does moral duty outweigh obedience to authority? Penkovsky's life provides no simple answers, only the profound illustration of human agency within a system designed to eliminate it. His choices, precise, disciplined, and courageous, became the fulcrum upon which history pivoted. Even now, the quiet hum of Moscow's streets, the faint echo of footsteps, and the distant whisper of wind against frosted windows serve as silent witnesses to a life lived in shadow. Oleg Penkovsky's existence, once hidden, now resonates across decades, a testament to the interplay of knowledge, courage, and consequence. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a stark example of how individual agency, exercised in secrecy and peril, can alter the course of human events. As the world moved beyond 1962, the lessons of Penkovsky's actions became embedded not only in classified archives, but also in the consciousness of leaders, analysts, and citizens who understood at some level the fragility of global peace. The moral and historical weight of his decisions remained, quietly shaping the framework for intelligence, diplomacy, and the ethical considerations of national security. He had operated in darkness, yet the light of his contributions illuminated paths that might otherwise have been lost to history. The snow falls quietly over Moscow, indifferent to history yet witness to it nonetheless. Footsteps echo faintly along empty streets, and doors close with deliberate finality. In these spaces, Penkovsky's legacy persists, a reminder that the courage of a single individual, armed with knowledge and conscience, can shape the destinies of nations. The corridors of secrecy may close around him, the machinery of state may seek to erase or control, but history retains the truth of his impact, the subtle power of his choices, and the enduring lesson that even in the shadows, one life can matter profoundly. The corridors of Moscow and the quiet streets of the world now carry only the echoes of Penkovsky's courage. Yet, in every secret report, in every tense negotiation, and in every reflection on the Cuban Missile Crisis, his choices continue to ripple through history. The shadows he walked linger still, whispering a timeless lesson. That one individual, armed with intellect, conscience, and resolve, can tip the balance between catastrophe and survival. If this journey into the hidden world of spies and double lives captured your attention, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps uncover more stories from the shadowed corners of history. And speaking of shadows, the game of secrets and covert power did not end with Penkovsky. In our next episode, we dive into 1963, exploring the JFK assassination and the web of spy theories surrounding the CIA, the KGB, and the hidden Cold War war that few ever saw. Prepare to step deeper into intrigue, betrayal, and the untold operations that shaped history from behind the scenes. Stay with us, because the shadows are only growing darker, and the story is far from over.